Okay, so now last but certainly not least, Rabbi Bentzion Halberstam is not to be confused with the Baba Rebbe of the same name. He serves Cal Hasidim in Westgate, which is in Lakewood, New Jersey, and is a posek in his own right. Again, questions can be asked either through the various social media channels that this event is being streamed, as well as if you're, let's say, watching, as well as in Zoom. If you're watching it, let's say on Torah Anytime, right, where comments are not available, you are able to present questions using a contact form on techeiles.org/QA, and after Rabbi Halberstam speaks, questions will be asked through that means as well. Okay, so I'm going to go and add Rabbi Halberstam to the stream here. Okay, welcome Rabbi Halberstam.
Hello, and it's good to be part of this very important event. I would like first to express my hakudas hatoiv for my friend, Rafi Hecht, even though we've never met, but we're friends because there's something that we have very much in common. Actually, all Yidden have it in common. It says, Ki haim chayayni, the Torah is our life, which means it's our very essence. So while, Goyim have all kinds of things, by the Yidden, those all kinds of things are just secondary, and our very essence is the Torah. It's what brings us together, it's what makes us one, and it's what creates the love that exists in Klal Yisrael. I will also mention that there is an interesting thing from the Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Netzate. He talks about the Milchamta Shel Torah, and he says that we find that Talmidei Chachomim argue, and sometimes it appears as though they're arguing very vehemently, and it looks as though there's some sort of a shall we say, a lack of enough love that should exist between Yidden. But he says that the purpose of the Milchamta Shel Torah is because really every Yid, in essence, knows the Torah. It says a similar thing in Balatanya, one of his letters at the end of the Sefer, that L'usid Lovoi, when there won't be a Yaitzahara, all of the Yidden will know the Torah just by their very nature, because it's in our neshama. The Torah is part of our neshama. We know the Torah, we feel it. But because we have the Nisyonis, we have the Yaitzahara, that's what gets in our way, all the Midas Ruis. It creates some sort of, it colors our judgment, so that when we sit down to learn a shtickle Gemura, a piece of Gemura, we might not understand the Gemura. We might have a kash on the Gemura. It's because our mind is not clear because of all the extra things that are presented to us through the Yaitzahara. So obviously, no two people have the same nisyonis. Everybody's Yaitzahara presents a bit differently. So when two people learn together, and somebody feels that the other person is just simply not right, what he's saying is wrong, I can feel it's wrong, and obviously it's rooted in the other person with some sort of a fallacy, some sort of a pigam in his midas, which is caused by the Yaitzahara. So therefore, I'm going to fight it. I'm going to help him in his melchumah that he has against his Yaitzahara, and I'm going to help him fight it by explaining to him that this is wrong. And if he will make it a goal to know the Torah la'amita, to know the real truth of the Torah, then he will rise above that chesurim that he has, and he will cleanse himself of that piece of Yaitzahara. In particular, when it comes to the issue of Techeiles, there's a lot that we have to overcome. And I find that, when I originally started studying this, it took me a couple of months. I really feel I left no stone that I came across, uncovered. And I went through it, I considered all possibilities. But the first thing I had to do, because I knew that if I'm going to conclude that this Techeiles is emes, I'm going to have to wear it. And it's not going to be easy, because I'm going to stand out among my family, among my society. People have told me that it's going to cause harm to me in many different ways, that I'm going to be considered some sort of an unusual type of a person. And I usually like being a traditional person. So in order to actually allow myself to see this for what it is and to study it objectively without any bias, I had to say, listen, what I'm doing now is I'm studying the actual material, the actual subject. it's not relevant how I feel about it and what it's going to cause me to do. That'll come later. And I put my biases aside, and I actually got into the crux of the matter. When I finished working through all the sources and all of the proofs, and I concluded that this is certainly beyond any reasonable doubt the emes Techeiles, the last step that I had was to see what is it that the opponents say. I mean, I know that there are a lot of people who don't wear Techeiles, and they're saying that this Techeiles is not the real Techeiles. What are they saying? What are their arguments? It seems to me so clear. I don't see any room to argue. And in fact, when I went into the into some of their arguments, it just confirmed that the Techeiles is emes because they have no arguments of substance. I'm sorry to say. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but it seems to me very clearly that the arguments are presented because their judgment, they don't really have room. They would have a problem. If they would conclude that this is Techeiles, they would have to wear it. And that's something that they have a hard time facing. And therefore, the only way they can face themselves to say, well, I'm not mechiyev because it's not Techeiles. And therefore, by hook or by crook, that will be the conclusion. And, when you see some of the kashas, which I hope to get to some of the kashas at the end of this discussion, you'll see that, in any other hilchise, such kashas would quickly be dismissed. Only here, when it comes to Techeiles, because of the difficulty that presents itself in being mekayem the mitzvah, so therefore these kashas are allowed, even by Talmidei Chachomim, to become part of the discussion. So I have a request. I'm going to be going through some of the things. Obviously, it took me a couple of months to study this, and I'm only going to be speaking for just one short speech. But I'm going to try to get through some of the essential points of the discussion. And I'm asking you, please listen with an open heart. And please listen with just putting the negiyas, the biases aside, and trying to accept and hear the material for what it is. So I'm going to go in an order like this. First of all, people ask a question. The Radzin was mentioned earlier in this event. The Radzin was a Rebbe, a liner, and he was a big Talmid Chochem and a tzaddik, and he pretty much said with certainty that he has discovered Techeiles. And the Gedolim of his time, for the most part, didn't agree with him. And later, it came to be understood what his mistake was, and that basically his Techeiles is probably not the correct Techeiles. So people say, look, here you have somebody who is a great Talmid Chochem, and he said with certainty that, the cuttlefish is the chillazon. And he turned out to be wrong. So now here you are, and you're saying that the murex trunculus is the chillazon. So at some point, somebody will say that you're wrong. So when a person is sure, I don't know if we can necessarily go by that just because you say that you're sure. So the first thing I would like to do is go through there is a basic difference between the way that the Radzin Rebbe determined that the cuttlefish is the Techeiles, is the chillazon of the Techeiles, to the way that we today know that the murex trunculus is the Techeiles. It's totally by a totally different method of learning, and the method that we have today is mechayev, it's conclusive, and it doesn't leave any room for doubt. Not so by the chillazon of the Radzin, as we will discuss. And then I will actually get into what the rayas are, that the murex trunculus is the chillazon of the Techeiles. And then there's another element which I think is very important, and that is that some people feel that, it's very hard to put on Techeiles, when we live in a society with other people and we try to conform, as I mentioned earlier. So, there are a lot of mitzvahs that we can be mahada. There's a hiddah mitzvah. I can make more mehiddik tefillin, and I could have a mehiddik liliv and esrig. When it comes to tzitzis, I'm not going to do the most mehid. I'll be yoitze with kusher tzitzis that are luvon, and I'm not going to do the hiddah of Techeiles. So obviously, that seems to be missing a very important piece of information, and that is that the chiyuv of wearing Techeiles, it's a chiyuv guma. It's not optional. It's a requirement. Just like if a person doesn't wear tzitzis altogether, he's being mevatel mitzvah. The same way if a person doesn't wear Techeiles, he's being mevatel mitzvah says just the same. And we don't have the option to say that we would rather abstain. We would rather not be of the Techeiles wearers. So that's something I'll get into a little bit just to show that that's the way it is. And then we'll try to go through some of the kashas that people ask. And then there's an issue of mesorah, where some people say that we can only be mekayim a mitzvah if it's been passed on to us in a traditional way from generation to generation, whereas this mitzvah is something that we rediscovered on our own. So that's not mechayev us. We'll get into that discussion. And with that, I don't think we'll get into anything more, even though there are other things to talk about. But I think that'll be pretty much the discussion for today. So the first thing is the Radzin. So let's start with this. We have one source in Chazal which tells us what the tzitzis has to be made, the Techeiles has to be made of. And it says, Techeiles einik shaire eile min hachaluzon. The Techeiles is only kusha if it is made of the chaluzon. Also, shalom and chaluzon psila. If it's not the chaluzon, it's pusel, it's not kusha Techeiles. So what is a chaluzon? That's the question. So you have a Gemur in Menuchas brings a braise. Chaluzon zei gifoy doime liyom, ibriyusay doime ledog, va'oyle echad leshiv mishuna, v'dumoy tzoyvim Techeiles, lefichach dumov meribben. This chaluzon, the chaluzon, its gif, its body, resembles the yam, it resembles the sea. It's briyusay, which I suppose it means its physique somehow, resembles a fish. It emerges once in 70 years. With its blood, we dye Techeiles, and that's why it's expensive. So the Radzin wanted to take this braise and try to figure out on the basis of these simunim that are given here that it's similar to the sea and it's similar to a fish. So let's try to see if we can figure out what that must be. So he said, what does it mean? Chaluzon zei gifoy doime liyom. What does it mean that we say its gif is doime liyom? Its body is similar to the sea. So Rashi says it means mare gifoy, the appearance of its gif is doime to the sea. The word appearance could mean color. It doesn't necessarily mean color. But the Radzin said that it means mare gifoy hi mare Techeiles. The color of its body is the color of the Techeiles. And then he said that the cuttlefish has that color, so that means that it's the cuttlefish. Now, I'll say that the Gedolim of his time did not find this to be any conclusive evidence that it is the cuttlefish. First of all, if anyone knows anything about the cuttlefish, it's not blue. It could turn blue because it has a feature that a lot of octopus types of creatures have. It's like a chameleon. It changes colors. It blends into its environment. It could look like the seabed. It could look like a coral reef. It could look like lots of things. And I guess sometimes it might turn blue. But that's not to say that its color is generally blue. So b'chalal, the whole idea that he took this to mean that it's the cuttlefish is a bit hard to understand. But then, even if we would give him that given, naniach, that it's blue. So how many sea creatures would you say there are that are blue? I would say in the tens of thousands. I mean, there are millions of creatures in the sea. So how could this be a determining siman to show us what the chaluzon is? Then he went to the next thing that says in the braise, that the Gemara brings, briyusoi doime ledog. So Rashi says, Tavn is the yiknoi. It's gestalt. It's physique. Really, it would seem that these are not necessarily given as simunim to identify the chaluzon for people who don't know what the chaluzon is. Because if somebody doesn't know what the chaluzon is, he doesn't know the definition of the word chaluzon, it's hard to imagine that from these simunim, from saying that its appearance is like the sea and its physique is like a fish, suddenly I'm going to be able to identify it. It would more seem maybe that the Braisa had a different intention by saying these things. Maybe I give one idea, which is not necessarily the case, but it's just an idea. Maybe just like it says that the Techeiles is doime liyom, and the Techeiles itself looks like the sea because it's there to remind us that the sea is doime to the sky and the sky is doime to the kisa hakuved. So maybe the Braisa wants to tell us that the actual gif of the Chilazon has that resemblance. It reminds us of the sea from beginning to end. So it's doi miliyom. I guess it has a resemblance to the sea, maybe by the fact that it is in the sea, that it's a sea creature. So in that sense, it resembles the sea, or maybe some other way that it resembles the sea. And it's like a fish. So again, it's something that reminds us of the sea. I'm not saying that that's necessarily pshat, but it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's as good of a pshat as any other pshat that we have so far, where we try to say that these simunim are somehow going to help us figure out what it is when these simunim are so vague. But the Radzin said that doimel dog means it's like a fish. So he says, Rakis besuroi v'hilichoi b'mayim al yidai snapirov, the softness of its flesh and the way it moves around in the water through its fins, doimel dog is like a fish. Anyone who sees this interpretation kind of is left wondering, it's like a fish, it's soft like a fish, and it swims around like with fins. Like how did he conclude from that it means the cuttlefish? It's just not to be understood. Additionally, he says that there's a medrash that says on the pusik, it says lebulis al moisaichem, your clothing didn't get used, it didn't get rubbed out, it didn't get worn all the time that we were in the midbar. And it says that the children, when they were young, they had clothing, and the clothing grew together with them. So the Medrash says it's like the shell of a chilazon. It's like the clothing, like the house of a chilazon. That just like the chilazon, as it grows, its cloak grows with it. So the people in the midbar, as they grew, their clothing grew with them. So the Radzin says that the cuttlefish has some sort of a skin, which is some sort of maybe a hardish type of skin, which grows along with the actual cuttlefish. Again, I don't understand what he means to say by this, because as far as I know, every organism's skin grows with it. But if we're going to say that it means, a snail, a murex snail, then it is well understood, because the shell of the snail seems like a doimim. It seems like an inanimate object, even though it does in fact grow, and it, obviously it has some life to it, like a bone. But the way it appears as though it's like a house, it's a shell, and you have a snail inside, which the snail can move around, and sometimes it goes almost completely out of its shell, and then it goes back in. It's like baisa, it's like its home. It's not like part of an organism that has a skin. And that's similar. That could be sometimes compared to clothing, that, to say that the clothing grew with the children, just like the shell of the chilazon grows together with the actual slug that's inside the shell. And there are those that actually use this as some sort of a raya or a simon, that it means a snail, that it means a murex type of snail. But the Radzina, who uses these kind of simunim to figure out and to conclude that it is the cuttlefish, is really hard to understand. Most likely because the cuttlefish was known to have a secretion of some sort of an ink. It was called the tint fish, which means the ink fish. So he figured that's probably the source of an ink, is probably the source of a dye. And therefore he kind of, worked it through so that the simunim of Chazal should at least not contradict, and maybe even indicate somewhat that it is the cuttlefish. But certainly the Gedoyl's Manai didn't see this as any conclusive evidence. They said it's a hashura ba'alma. It's nothing more than a guess to say that it's the cuttlefish. It could just likely be anything else. Now, when it comes to the murex trunculus, the way we know it's the murex trunculus is not because we are trying to interpret the simunim that the Gemara brings here. Because if we would try to interpret those simunim, then it's open to interpretation. One person can interpret it this way, and someone can interpret it differently. So who's to say that it's necessarily correct the way we would interpret it? But it's different. The way we know is we start to try to see what does the word chilazon mean? And that will point us in the right directions. Well, if a chilazon has a meaning, if it's a word, and it has a meaning, then whatever that means, that is something that we have to consider as being the source of the chilazon, of the Techeiles. That is the chilazon. Additionally, we find other things which point directly. In other words, we're not going through simunim. We're going through means of where we find sources who directly point to this species and say, this is what we used for the Techeiles. This is the chillazon. So it's not something that's open to interpretation because it's been clearly identified. So the first means of identification is to know what the word chillazon means. And again, because we say that the chillazon, we have the only source, as we mentioned earlier, to say what the Techeiles has to be is that it has to be from a chillazon. So if we know the definition of the word chillazon, which, as I'll show you now, it means a snail, then we can conclude basically from this brayso that if something is a snail and it gives a dye, and the dye is the correct color, then it is kusha for Techeiles, because that's the only t'nai that we find in Chazal. We don't have any other sources of halucha besides Chazal, and if Chazal only give us this one t'nai, this one rule, this one caveat of what the color's source has to be from, then we know that if we meet that criteria, then it's kusha. So anything which is a chillazon and it produces the Techeiles color would be kusha for Techeiles. So how do I know that the word chillazon means a snail? So there are lots of ways of knowing. First of all, we'll start with this. I mean, I'm not going in any particular order. All of the proofs are just as good. But when you have a multitude of proofs, it kind of proves it in a very conclusive way. Like it's not possible to dismiss it because it's just proven from all different angles. So there was somebody who was a Rishon, and he wrote a dictionary soon after the Rambam. He was born a couple of years after the Rambam was nifta, and he writes a dictionary to define the words that we find in the Rambam. And his name was Reb Tanchem Yerushalmi. And under the entry chillazon, he writes that it is the same as what is called in Arabic al-chilazon. So in Arabic, the word al-chilazon or chillazon happens to mean a snail. The same way as in Assyriac, which is the modern Aramaic, to this very day, the word chillazon means a snail. So the word chillazon seems to mean a snail, unless you want to say that somehow the words, the language somehow changed over the years. But it's quite likely that the word chillazon from this alone means a snail. We find in the Sefer Urach, there was somebody around 200 years ago who put in Yiddish touch into the entries of the Urach, and under the word chillazon, he writes the word schneck. Schneck is the word in Yiddish, in German, for snail. So he says that chillazon is a snail. There's a Sefer Teves Uretz, which was also a little under 200 years ago. He defines the word choimet, which is a Lushan Kodesh word. He says it is al-chilazon, and he says from there we know that the chillazon of Techeiles is a type of a choimet, and he writes it is a schneck, it is a snail. The chillazon is a snail, he writes. He writes that the same thing we find, he uses the medrash that I mentioned earlier, that it says that the clothing grew together with the children. So he uses that as some sort of an indication that it must probably be the snail. But in any case, he says that from the fact that the word is chillazon, which chillazon means a shnek, a snail, so that's how we know that the chillazon of Techeiles is a snail. In the Perashah Mishnayos Rambam, there's a Mishnah in Keilim, it says, Shalsheles shekusha chillazon beroisha temaye. You have a chain that they tied a chillazon at one end, so it describes such a chillazon. The Rambam in the Perashah Mishnayos calls the chillazon a tzadafa, which the word tzadafa means a seashell. So again, the word chillazon is defined as being a creature which is in a seashell. Rashi in Avodah Zarah Daf Chuf Ches, there's the word mishkideh chalazoine, where the word chillazon is used. Rashi says limits, belaz, limits is a French word, and it means a snail. I looked it up in an old French dictionary, the oldest dictionary I was able to find, which was from the 17th century. But if somebody doesn't want to necessarily rely on a dictionary, even though the dictionary is quite a good thing. But we also find the word limtze used by other Rishonim, and Rashi in Shabbos Daf Ayin Zayin, where it says shablil. Shablil is also a snail. It says Nepuzik K'may shablil temes yalach. The word shablil means a snail. And Rashi says limtze, also the same word, the same French word. And Nagus Abach says limtze is a shnek, is a snail. So therefore we know that the word chilazon, which is defined as meaning limtze or limits, means a snail. The word chilazon is the same as shablil and choimet. We find the medrash that I mentioned earlier, it's quoted in Rashi. He brings the medrash. He says the medrash, as we look it up in our medrash that we have, it says a chilazon azeh. The chilazon, as it grows, its levish grows with it, its clothing grows with it. Rashi brings it. He says a choimet. He exchanges the word chilazon for the word choimet. The same medrash. He just uses a more familiar word. You have the Rosh, Perish Rosh al Torah. He uses the word shablil. Shablil and choimet and chilazon is the same thing. You have the Sefer HaSherushim from Rabbi Yoine ben Janach maybe. This was a very early Rishon. He was about 1,000 years ago. Other Rishonim bring him. And under the entry, Shein Bais Lamed, he brings the word Shablil. And he says Shablil is probably the same as Chilazon. So therefore, if we know what Shablil is, which is a shnek, so we know Chilazon is a shnek. We have the Marie Koyen, which was a son-in-law of the Maral Miprag. On Medrash Tilim, he writes Chilazon, Choimet. Chilazon is a choimet, which is a snail. I already mentioned the Sefer Tvias Ugatz, where he says choimet is a shnek. Rashi, he says choimet ani oime. It's a mean sheretz shekayim limtze. Just in case we want to see. The Bach says that the limtze is a snail, but Rashi says limtze is something which is gudal beklipe. It grows in a shell. Hahoyleiches in ma'agelis tumid. It goes in circles around and around as much as it grows. Kol kamish gudal. So again, we have the Radak that on the word choimet, he says choimet is a sheretz which is called limtze. He says the word shablil also means a limtze. So whenever we find the word limtze in the Rishonim, as I mentioned, in the Rabbi Gershon, in B'choires Daf Lamed Ches, says chilazon is a limits. So therefore we know that the word limtze is the same as a choimet, it's a snail. So from all of these proofs, we know that the word choimet is a snail. There are more proofs. That's going to come soon. Those are more conclusive proofs, which are in direct referring to the chilazon of the Techeiles. But here I'm just referring in general to the word chilazon, which means a snail. It's hard to say different after you see all of these sources that the word chilazon means a snail. So the word chilazon means a snail. So here we have a snail, which we know was used as a dye, and it does serve. It can be used as a dye. It has a dye in it. It can make the Techeiles. It makes the Techeiles color. And we can dye wool with it, and it's kusha for Techeiles because that's what the Tosefta says. And Techeiles is einig shayre than chilazon. That is the only prerequisite. It's the only t'nai that we have to say what Techeiles has to be. There is more, and that is that we have Gedolim who actually said clearly that the murex has another name. It's also called pilpira. Pilpira is an old Greek word. It was already mentioned earlier in this event by some of the other speakers. It means the murex we find in some of the works of the older Chachmei Imis, Aristotle and Pliny. The word pilpira is used interchangeably with the word murex. It's the same thing. We find even today the word pilpira is used in some places where they still use a murex snail to dye. I recently found out there's a place in South America called Oaxaca, and they actually do still dye with the dye that comes out of a murex, and they call it purpura. So obviously the word purpura is the same as the word murex. That's the same thing. And the purpura is something that it's a word that has not gotten lost over the generations. It's something that's been used throughout history, and it continues to mean the same thing to this very day. And it means a snail. It means a murex snail. Now we have Gedoyla Kadmoinim. We have the Shilta Geboirim, he was a cipher that gets quoted by Toisus Yontif, some places, and other Gedolim. He was in Shinai Bais over 400 years ago. He writes that he talks about he says, Belushin Yuvon, Remes Hayom, Hanikr Pirper. There is a creature of the sea which is called Pirper. Vehi HaChaluzon Shetzoivim Boi Techeiles. That is the Chaluzon that we dye Techeiles out. You have the Teyafis Ra'aim, which is a parish on the Yerayim from the year Tufreishni and Bais, and he writes, the Chalazon, v'ha Chalazon shetzovim medumei Techeiles, nikri Chalazon adoimi pirpir shneke. The Chilazon that we dyed Techeiles is called Chilazon adoimi. It's pirpir shneke, the pirpire snail. The Shamshal Fungel Hirsch used the same word pirpir shneke when he, on the Pusi Kishefa Yamam Yunuk, he talks about the Chilazon, which was in the Chaylik of Zevin, and he said it's called, the Chilazon is called pirpir shneke, the pirpir snail. The Yavitz, the Rabbi Yankiv Emden, he brings some of the things from the Chachmei Mesorah, from the historians, from the Goyish historians, in connection to the Tzaida, the capturing of the Chilazon, and he writes that this Chilazon was found, the same as our Gemara Masechtes Shabbos says that the Nevizaradon left over Yidden to create dye out of the Chilazon, in order to create malbishim for the king, and in those areas, that's where that's where the Chachmei Mesorah write that that's the source of the Chalazon. Techeiles was made over there, and Rabbi Yankiv Emden says that to which the historians, the history books, the Goyish history books refer, that is the same as the Chalazon of the Techeiles. The same thing is in the Radal, in his parish in Pirkei Rabbi Lezer, where he also writes the same thing, that the Pirpira is the same thing that the Chachmei Mesorah talk about, and that's the Chilazon of the Techeiles. Additionally, we have a Chavas Yuir, who was one of the very earlier Achronim, and he writes, the Dam Chilazon sheboy tzoivim Techeiles, the blood of the Chilazon, out of which we dye Techeiles. I know blue, it's not blue, rak tzeva purple. It's the color purple, I guess he means purple. Shenase midam dog shenikra hadam pirper. It's made out of a type of a sea creature, which is called pirper. So he's saying that the actual blood, the actual secretion as it comes out isn't blue, even though the final product of the Techeiles is blue, but the blood of the Chilazon isn't blue. It starts off as being purple, as we had already seen earlier in this event where some of the previous speakers spoke about that and showed how originally when it comes out of the Chilazon it's purple, and then later through the correct process of processing the Techeiles, it gets its correct color of Techeiles, of blue. So you have the Chavas Yuir who identifies it. He says it's purple, and he even describes a little bit of the process, and when it comes out, the blood isn't blue. It starts off as purple. We have the Ramban ala Torah, which he doesn't say beferish, but it seems to be a good indication. He says in Parashat Tetzaveh, where the Torah mentions Techeiles, he says that Techeiles, until this very day, nobody would dare to wear it except for the Melech Goyim. And we know that the Ramban in other parts of the Torah, he said Melech Goyim refers to the Melech Roimi. It's known that there was exire, there was a decree against a person who's not of royalty to wear a garment that's dyed with Techeiles. It was reserved only for royalty, and there were times that was even punishable by death if somebody else would try to wear Techeiles. So the Ramban says that the Techeiles, even to this very day, I guess even in his time, there was the Byzantine Empire, which continued not to allow people to wear Techeiles. It was reserved for the royalty. So it seems to be an indication. He says it's something which is reserved for the Melech Goyim. So I guess he's referring to that. But in any case, all of these other sources besides the Ramban are much clearer, where they directly point to that which the Chachmei Mesorah refer, and they directly say that that is the Chalazon of the Techeiles, and it's called Pirpira. So, in this sense, it's not similar at all to the way the Radzin identified the Chilazon. Over here, we're identifying it because the word Chilazon means a snail, and this is a snail. So it's directly identified. It's not identified through a siman, through some sort of a proof. It's identified because it's been pinpointed and described as what it is. The same is with all of these achronim that I mentioned. They clearly say that the Chalazon at Techeiles is the Pirpira. So it's not a siman, it's somebody directly identifying and saying this is what it is. So that's conclusive. It doesn't leave any room for ambiguity. There's no suffix here. There's no room to say maybe we can interpret things differently. There's no interpretation. It's a direct identification of what the Chalazon is. Therefore, nobody could say that the Chalazon is not the Pirpira, because if he would do so, he would be arguing on all of these gedolim, and there's no reason to argue. It seems that that's what it is from, it's the conclusion, the logical conclusion that anyone would come to. But even if a person would think differently, who has the authority to argue in all of these gedolim, Yisroel, the Chavas Yuah, and Rabbi Yankiv Emden, all of the ones that I mentioned? And one might say, well, maybe, there are other achronim who maybe say differently. There aren't any other achronim. There's nobody else who identified the Chilazon as being anything else besides the Pilpira, except for the Radzin. And the Radzin was clearly, disproven, and the Gedolei Zmanoi did not agree with him. So besides that, nobody else gave any other identity for the Chilazon. And here you have a Gedolei Kadmoinai achronim who say what it is. So that's it. So therefore, that is the Chilazon. So that's how we know that the murex trunculus is a kosher source for Techeiles, the kosher source or a kosher source for the Techeiles. Now we're going to get into the discussion that it is a chiyuv gum. If Techeiles is available, we are mechiyev, we are obligated to put on the Techeiles onto our talis, onto our tzitzis. First of all, it says in the Torah, it says we should wear tzitzis, vusilam tzitzis, al kanfa b'gdam d'resim, and v'nosni al tzitzis akunaf tzedchayles. Why would I say that it's not a chiyuv gumah, just like it tells you to wear the tzitzis? The Rambam says that the mitzvah has two tziviyim, nimtze b'mitzvah zi shnai tziviyim. One is sha'oisa al akunaf unaf hayotzim menu. You make some sort of an unaf, a branch that comes out of it of strings. And the next tziviyah is sheyichach al unaf chit chayles. She'neimah v'usilam tzitzis, v'nosni al tzitzis akunaf tzedchayles. The Rambam doesn't say that there's any difference, that one is a chiyuv, one isn't a chiyuv. It's a chiyuv. We have the Braise that says, the punishment for somebody who doesn't wear luvon, he doesn't wear tzitzis altogether, is bigger than the punishment of somebody who wears luvon but doesn't wear techelet. And he gives a mushal, Ramai gives a mushal, the melech, Busa V'dam, a king, he tells two of his servants. To one of them he says, bring me a chosim shel tit, bring me a seal of tit, a stamp made out of clay. And to the other one he says, bring me a seal made out of gold. So both of them don't fulfill the command of the king. So the one who was supposed to bring a seal made out of clay, he gets a much bigger punishment because clay is a cheap thing. Anyone could get it. So the fact that he didn't bring it is a clear rebellion against the king. It's a very serious offense. Whereas the person who doesn't bring the golden seal, so he's also rebelling against the king. He didn't obey the words of the king. But you can say it was a little bit more difficult because gold is expensive and it's harder to get hold of. So he gets punished for not obeying the king, but the punishment is not as severe. It's not as big as the punishment for someone who doesn't wear tzitzis altogether. This is the same thing here with Techeiles and Luvon. Techeiles, as I mentioned before, it says dum of meribben. It's very expensive. It's not so easy to get. Luvon is just simple strings of wool. It's very easy to get. It's very cheap, inexpensive. So if somebody doesn't wear tzitzis altogether, it's like not wearing a mitzvah that's so easy to do. If somebody doesn't put on Techeiles, it's a little harder, so the punishment is less. When the Gemara says there's a punishment, obviously, it's a chiyuv. It's not optional. It's an obligation to put the tzitzis, to put the Techeiles on the talis. We have the Gemara that says the Malach found Rav Ketina, and Rav Ketina used to always wear clothing that's made out of linen because there was exire that you're not allowed to put Techeiles onto a clothing that's made out of linen because we might come to put it onto a night garment, which is puta from tzitzis, and then it'll be shatnez because the Techeiles is wool, and the linen Techeiles with linen with wool together is shatnez. It's an issa. So they made exire that on a beged, on an article of clothing which is linen, we shouldn't wear Techeiles. So the Malach, founder of Ketina, he said, you're always wearing linen clothing. In the winter, you're wearing winter clothing that's linen. In the summer clothing that's linen. What's going to be with Techeiles? So Rav Ketina says, they punish. And Shisa, Esa, they punish for mitzvahs Esa. If someone's not Mekayim, a positive commandment, there's a punishment. So Tosfos says, what do you mean? Of course there's a punishment. It says that if a person doesn't want to be Mekayim a mitzvah, you have to force him and you hit him, you beat him until he dies. Of course there's a punishment. The person's obligated to be Mekayim in mitzvahs. So Tosfos says, yeah, but if a person could avoid ever becoming obligated if he doesn't wear an article of clothing that has 4 corners. So if Katina said, listen, I'm wearing an article of clothing which is not mechiv b'tzitzis, because the chachumim, just like if you don't wear four corners, the same way if you wear linen, the chachumim exempt us from putting Techeiles onto it. So therefore, I'm puta. So what punishment is there? So the Malach said, well, it's not right that you're trying to find ways. Tachbilos means to try to get out, to weasel your way out of having to be mekayim a mitzvah. So in a time when Hashem is scrutinizing and looking very carefully, and there's a time of anger in the world, then Hashem will punish for somebody, even if he's not violating a mitzvah, but if he's trying to avoid being mekayim a mitzvah this way, there would be a punishment. But we see from here that if we would not do a tachbil, if we would wear a beged, which is not exempt from Techeiles, then Tosfos said, of course there's a punishment. You force a person like that to put on Techeiles. Additionally, we have there's a lot. I don't know if I should go through all of the proofs, but we have the Gemara in Shabbos where it says that the Talmidim of Rabbi Bentzion Halberstam, they came, they found Erev Shabbos, they found him after he prepared himself for Shabbos. They found him, he was wearing sardinim, which are made out of linen, together with tzitzis, Techeiles, Pashtus, it means the machloikis or rishonim, whether it means Techeiles or it means stam tzitzis. And the Talmidim didn't wear because they were afraid of the gzaira, mishim ksis laila, the gzaira that a person might put Techeiles onto a linen garment, which is a night garment, which is exempt from tzitzis. So therefore, they held that the chachumim paskin, that they exempt this beged from tzitzis, from Techeiles. So Rabbi Lewis said to them, didn't I teach you that a sadin betzitzis, an article of clothing which is made out of linen, bishamai poitrin, bishamai patis from tzitzis, bisil mechayvin, bisil is mechayv, the haluch is like bisil. So they say, yes, true. It's true that the haluch is like bisil, that it's essentially chayiv, but it's puta because there's gzaira mishim ksis lail. So there's a machlokes rishonim. What are we talking about? Are we talking about wearing tzitzis all together, that the gzaira is even on luvon, so they didn't wear tzitzis all together? And then, we wouldn't necessarily have an indication from here that there's a chiyuv, there's basil and mechayven, they're mechayev to wear, and then maybe they're mechayev to wear tzitzis to begin with, just tzitzis of luvon. But there's another pshat in Tosfos, brings a shiva of Rashi, where he says that of course they wore tzitzis of luvon, but the question here is about tzitzis of Techeiles. That was the question on tzitzis of Techeiles. If you don't wear it, if you have an article of clothing made out of linen, you're not puta from luvon, but you are puta from Techeiles. And on that, Rabbi Bentzion said to them, the basil is mechayev, and they agreed, yes, it's mechayev, but they exempt us when it comes to a beged of linen. We're only mechayev with other begudim that are not linen, because when it comes to linen, we have gzaira mishim ksis laila. So, who are the rishonim who say it means Techeiles? So, as we mentioned, it's the chief of Rashi, also the Rif, the Ramban, the Rashba, the Ran, the Meiri, the Tosfos Rosh. All of these rishonim say it means Techeiles. So from all these rishonim, you see basil mechayev, and it's a chiv guma. It's not something that's optional. It's a complete obligation. It says mechayev. But even those who say it's referring to tzitzis altogether, it's not they hold that Techeiles is not a chiv, but they hold, the Balamu explains, they hold that if we're going to pater him from Techeiles, we have to pater him from luvon also, because since Techeiles and luvon are equally obligated, they're both the same in terms of being an obligation. They're both a chiv. There's no difference between them. So how can we differentiate and say that they're only exempt from Techeiles and not exempt from luvon? A person would not know to differentiate because there's no difference. They're both the same. They're equal. So you see, even from those who argue and hold that the Gemara is talking about luvon, but that's not to say that Techeiles isn't a chiyuv. It's to say that luvon and Techeiles are equally mechiyev, and that's why there's no difference between luvon and Techeiles. So it comes out that all of the rishonim from this Gemara we see hold that Techeiles is a chiyuv gum. And again, not that we need to prove it. It's obvious that it's a chiyuv gum. There's no reason to say it isn't. But then we have we have Tosfos in Eizei Neshech. It says the Eibishter says, I'm going to punish somebody who puts on fake tzitzis, which doesn't have a kosher source, kala ilon, which is an indigo plant. He makes the Techeiles out of that. I'm going to punish him because I could tell the difference. So Tosfos says, what's the avayra? The avayra is that he wasn't making the mitzvah of Techeiles. So Hashem is going to punish him. The Shagas Aryeh asks a kasha. The Shagas Aryeh says, in his time, there was not Techeiles. Techeiles was not available. So the Shagisaya asks a kasha, why should we wear a talis altogether if we don't have Techeiles? If we don't wear a talis, then we're not mechiv in anything. If we wear a talis, we're mechiv to put on luvon and we're mechiv to put on Techeiles. We don't have Techeiles, so we're violating a mitzvah. Wouldn't it be better just not to wear a talis? That way we're not violating a mitzvah. So he says this. He says, to answer that question, he says, there is a machloikis of Rishonim. What is the chiv? When is the chiv of putting on Techeiles, of putting on tzitzis? When does that kick in? When is it chal? Is it chal that you're not allowed to put on a beged which doesn't have tzitzis? Or is it that when you wear a beged, that suddenly is mechayev that you have to have tzitzis on the beged? But it's not that you're not allowed to put on the beged before it has tzitzis. It's that when you're wearing it, it is mechayev to have tzitzis. So he says that is the correct pshat. Apparently, that's the way we hold, because otherwise we would not wear a talis that doesn't have Techeiles. Because you're not, if the emes would be that you're not allowed to put on a talis without tzitzis, you're also not allowed to put on a talis without Techeiles. You wouldn't be allowed to put it on. But that's not the fact. The fact of the matter is you're allowed to put on the talis, and then you become mechiyev to put on tzitzis. So if you have Techeiles, you put it on. If you don't have Techeiles, you're an oinus. But you never did anything against halucha. There was never an issa to put on the talis. So therefore, we do it, and we put on a talis with only luvan to be at least mekan mitzvah of luvan. And we're not over anything that we don't have Techeiles, because we're an oinus. We don't have the Techeiles, so therefore we're exempt. We're an oinus chachmuna patrai. So again, we see from the Shagisari that when Techeiles is available, like today, Techeiles mutzi, so to put on a talis and not to wear Techeiles is the same as putting on a talis and not putting. Nobody would put on a talis and leave the corners without tzitzis. Everybody knows that's a bitl mitzvah sasa. That's a violation. That's of a mitzvah sasa to omit the kiyum of a mitzvah sasa. Chas v'shulim, nobody would do that. The Shagisai says the same thing would be to put on a talis if you don't put on Techeiles, except if it's not available, you put it because it's honest. But today that it's available, it's a chiyuv guma. So therefore, it also becomes incumbent upon us to determine whether or not this is Techeiles. You know something? I don't want to study this. I'd rather not know. I'd rather bury my head in the sand. No, because if it's Techeiles, you're mechiyev to wear it, so you better find out what it is. And if because you decided to bury your head in the sand and not to know the halucha, that's not a shoygig, that's a maizid. You have the ability to find out what it is. Not everybody has the ability. Some people aren't capable of researching and passing on. Most people maybe aren't capable. They have to ask their roof. So if their roof happens to be a person who says that it's not Techeiles, then I guess what could they do? But anyone who's capable of researching it, be'emes, with an open mind, they're mechiyev to do so because it's a chiyuv guma. Now let's go into some of the kashas that are asked in connection to the Techeiles. I want to show how the kashas are really not kashas. They don't begin to be kashas. But let me first start off with a little bit of a hakdum. Somebody comes and asks a kasha. He found some source somewhere, who knows where, a rishon or something that I didn't know about. And it seems he has a kasha. If this is Techeiles, then how could we understand what it says over there? So I want to tell you, not every time that a person asks a kasha do I suddenly have to reverse myself and put myself back in limbo of not knowing whether the Techeiles, whether the murex trunculus is the chillazon, and whether my Techeiles is Techeiles or not. You're not mechiyev to do that. Not all questions are matal sufik, create an actual sufik about whether or not this is the Techeiles. There are questions that even if left unanswered, even if I don't know the answers to those questions, still, my proof is conclusive, and I'm mechiyev to wear the Techeiles. We find this idea. We have the Rabbi Nechananel that the Yosef brings in Choshen Mishpat Siman Samach Beis. The Gemara asks a kasha on a particular halucha, and the Gemara concludes kasha. It's a kasha. The Gemara doesn't answer the kasha. The Gemara says it's a kasha. And the Rishonim, yet even though the Gemara has a kasha, they still paskin this halucha, even though we had a kasha that we didn't know how to answer it. So the Bis Yosef says that the Rabbi Nechananel brings from the Geonim that we do not cast aside a halucha because it says kasha. Kasha means we have a kasha, we don't know how to answer it, but somebody else might know the answer. When it says in the Gemara tiyivte, the word tiyivte means a retraction. We're taking it back. We're going back. Tiyivte. We're returning it. It's a retraction. So when it says tiyivte, that means we've totally retracted the memory. But when it says kasha, it means I have a kasha. So a kasha could still be the halucha. And this Yosef said that the same thing the Rivosh says and the Rashba says, and it brings the whole thing, that this is the halucha. What does that mean? How could we still hold on to halucha after we have a kasha on that halucha? So let me try to explain this in a practical sense. There are kashas that if somebody would ask a kasha and say, listen, you're telling me that the chilazon is the murex trunculus and it's mechayev to wear techeiles because the word chilazon means a snail. You're also telling me that all of these gedolah poskim said that it means a shnek. So, but you have a mistake because all of these svurim that you're bringing, there is a mistake. They were all somehow printed by somebody who had some sort of a sinister motive, and he can prove to me that this whole thing is one big mistake. And the whole thing, it's all a misprint. It's all somebody who printed all of these sources, and it's wrong. Now, if there's any chance that such a thing could be, obviously it's just an absurd idea which cannot be, isn't, and nobody presented such a kasha. But if somebody would say such a thing genuinely, and he would say that he's sure and that that's the way it is, I would have to consider that, because he is challenging the very premise upon which I'm basing what I'm saying. I'm saying that you're mechiyev to wear the murex trunculus techeiles because that's what the word chilazon means, and that's what these gedolah kadmonim say. And here he's telling me that they don't say that, and it's not what the chilazon means. So we have to get to the bottom of it. He's asking a kasha which is challenging the very underlying premise of what I'm saying. So such a kasha needs to be addressed. It needs to be determined whether it's true or whether it's not true. But if somebody asks a kasha like this, and this is a kasha that is asked, it's asked even by Talmidei Chacham. How could you say that the chilazon is the murex trunculus? The murex trunculus, as we know, is a snail, and a snail moves very slowly. The Gemara says that if somebody captures a snail on Shabbos, he's chayav. It's tzayde. There's a melucha on Shabbos capturing a balchai. There cannot be a melucha of tzayde on a snail which hardly moves. It's captured. If you can capture it b'shchi with one bend, you bend down and you pick it up. So it's captured before you even start. There cannot be an issa and a melucha of tzayde on a snail. So since it says that there is tzayde by the chilazon, so the chilazon is obviously not a snail. So that is a kasha that is not relevant, doesn't need to be addressed, even if I don't know the answer. I do know the answer. The kasha is not a kasha to begin with, as we'll get into it. But even if it is a kasha, I don't have to address that kasha, and I can continue with my knowledge that the murex trunculus is a kosher source of techeiles. Why is that? Because he has not been able to challenge my proofs that the word chilazon means a snail. The word chilazon certainly means a snail. There's no doubt that the word chilazon means a snail. So he's asking a kasha, since it means a snail, how is there tzayde? That's a very good question, maybe. It's not a good question, but if it's a good question. So I guess I have a question in Hilchis tzayde. But the question is not a question which could possibly say that the word chilazon doesn't mean a snail. It certainly means a snail, and we've proven that. Additionally, Rashi says that the word chomet means a snail. I brought the Rashi says clearly the word chomet means a limtze, means a snail. And chomet is one of the shmoyne shrutzim. It's one of the shrutzim that are mentioned in Parashat Shmini, that it says in the Mishnah in Shabbos that if somebody captures it on Shabbos, he's chayav mishum tzayde. So it says clearly that a snail is one of them. He's chayav mishum tzayde. So I don't know why. I mean, it happens that it doesn't say anywhere in Shulchan Aruch that if an organism goes slowly, there's no tzayde. It says that if something is captured, I guess it's talking about something that can free itself and it can escape, and you've captured it to the point that it's now easy to get to it. So now there won't be tzayde again because you've already done tzayde with it. But a type of an organism which to begin with is easy to get, it doesn't say anywhere that there's no tzayde on that. It also says that if you have an organism which is sick and therefore doesn't move, so there's no tzayde on that. It's the same thing. I guess it's sickness captured it because by nature it's something that moves very quickly. But a type of a creature that doesn't move quickly, nowhere does it say that there's no tzayde on that. It happens to be that there is a Rishon who argues with Rashi, and he says, the Tosfos Rid, that the chomet cannot mean a snail. So he's going against many Rishonim who, do define the word chomet, as I brought earlier. I didn't bring all of the sources for chomet. I left some of them out, but there are lots of sources for chomet, that the word chomet clearly means a snail. But the Tosfos said it can't mean a snail because then there wouldn't be tzaydi. He obviously holds of this svur, even though it's not brought in Shulchan Aruch. But it still would not be relevant to the Chilazon, because the Gemara says, it's a Gemara in Bayit, and the Masechtas Bayit, and the Gemara says that Zeh Klal, the Mishnah, Kol HaMechiset Tzayde, Usa, V'sha'ayim Mechiset Tzayde, to any organism which needs Tzayde, which requires Tzayde in order to get it, so it's Usa to capture it. Such a creature that doesn't need Tzayde, it's Mitzvah. So the Gemara says, what does it mean? What's the case of something that needs Tzayde? So Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Yehuda Mashmin, Kol sha'omer huvay mitzideh nitzidani. Any organism that one would say, let's bring some sort of equipment, some sort of a trap, so that we could trap it, that means that it's mechiset tzayde. And Rashi says, what does that mean? Shetzurich levakish tachbile letofsoy. You need to find some sort of a tachbile, some sort of a method to catch it. Now the Chilazon is on the bottom of the sea. So either you need scuba diving equipment, which today I guess we have, they didn't have it in those days, but scuba diving equipment is certainly a tachbila. It's not something that one readily can grab. You can't just go to the sea and grab a Techeiles, grab a Chilazon. And in fact, what they did was they used to capture them by lowering baskets into the sea, baited, and the Chilazon over time would slowly go into that basket. They used the trap. It was huvay mitzid and nitzidani. So the kasha on many levels doesn't begin to be a kasha. And people ask this kasha. And they say, therefore, because they can't be tzayid on a Chilazon, therefore it's not the Chilazon, therefore it's puta. It's amazing. It's actually astonishing that they don't bother to scrutinize this kasha to see that it's not a kasha. They just, it's like just on the surface, they think it's a kasha, and on the base of that to be mavatla mitzvah says, it's as I said in the beginning of the discussion. There is a bias. There is a need to conclude. Many people just need to conclude. They must conclude that it's not the Chilazon, not Techeiles, because if it is, then they have to wear it. And obviously, that's something that they would have a hard time with. So the easiest way out is to just kind of find some sort of proof. But these proofs are not proofs. That's one kasha. There's another kasha. People say that they bring a kasha that it says in Kisvay Ari, Arizal, Kabula. So, the way they say is that the Arizal says that there cannot be a Techeiles bisman hazeh. We can't have Techeiles when there's no bismikdash. So it can't be that he says that, by the way, because there was Techeiles when there was no bismikdash. The bismikdash was churev, and you still had the tanuim that were after the chol bismikdash and the amaruim, and the Techeiles was still around until the end of the tekifa of the gemur of the amaruim, until the rabbunas avarui. Hundreds of years the Techeiles was around after the chol bismikdash. So obviously. The Riyah Kudish does not say that, but let's quote the words of the Riyah Kudish. I'm not going to quote anything that has kabula diki kavuna, but I'm just going to quote what he speaks around it. He says a kavuna al pi kabula, and then after that he says, therefore v'luchain, because of this kavuna, which is shaykh, it has some connection to having a Beis Hamikdash. V'luchain hoyenoyig bizman shebeis hamikdash kam. Therefore, this mitzvah was done, you were mekayim the mitzvah during the times of the Beis Hamikdash. Al tzitzis al lovon, the white tzitzis she'uni noheg moyam that we have today is he medalid moichen aklilim bebined de'ime. He says a kavuna what it is. V'zehi hatam she'ayin lo nit Techeiles bizman hazeh. That's the reason that we don't have Techeiles today. And he writes later that in fact, the Iyun that the Techeiles has to be mekayim, the kabula diki kavuna that the Techeiles has to accomplish for the tikkun oilam, exactly what it's accomplishing in the depths of the oilam Yisrael gets accomplished today, but it doesn't get accomplished through our deeds because we're not capable of doing that because we don't have the Beis Hamikdash. He writes that she'ain luni atu koyach. We do not have the koyach that this should be done through our actions. So he writes, therefore we don't have Techeiles. Now, obviously, what does he mean? Does he mean to say that if we have Techeiles, we shouldn't wear it? Chas v'shulim. How could he say that? How could he be mevatel a mitzvah? No poskim say that. Nowhere does it say. There's no gimur. There's nothing to say that they could be techeiles in amchia fakeh. I've shown you that if there is techeiles, you are mechiv to wear it. Not only that, but you have there's a certain application lahalucha, and that is whether you're allowed to wear today a beged of pishton with tzitzis. So there are poskim who say that even today we shouldn't wear it. The reason originally that you shouldn't wear it is because if there was techeiles, somebody might put on techeiles and somebody might put on an imitation of techeiles, and it'll be shatnez shaloi b'mukim mitzvah. So, but today that there's no possibility. Today means not today. Today means today before the rediscovery of techeiles. If there's no possibility of anyone wearing techeiles, so nobody would wear an imitation either. So there's no fear of anybody being over on the issa of shatnez, because they'll use strings of linen to pat a beged of linen. They won't use strings of wool, because why would they? It's not that we don't have techeiles. But there are poskim who say that we should not wear a beged of pishton, because the gzaira is still shaykh, and they quote the Maril says that it's possible that techeiles will be rediscovered. And the other poskim bring it, the Oilis Tumid, who is a posik that the Magen Avraham brings all the time. And the Malbim, the Artzis HaChaim, is a posik that the Mishnah Berurah brings all the time. They say that the techeiles could come about. They also bring the Radvaz, that the Radvaz says that it's possible that the techeiles is around somewhere. It's just we don't know. We don't know how to identify it, but it's possible that it exists. So therefore, the poskim say it could be rediscovered. So clearly, they did not understand. The poskim, the Maril says it could be rediscovered. We'll be mechiv. We'll be wearing techeiles. There's no way to say that the Arizal says that even if we have techeiles, we don't have to be mekayim a mitzvah in the Torah. It's impossible. Chulil v'chulil. I mean, to say that is kimat kuruv tapikosis, that the mitzvah is brutal. We say in the animamens every day, the Torah will not be changed. There won't be a different Torah. The Torah which says you put on techeiles is the same Torah that we have today. If we have techeiles, we have to put it on. So maybe there's a different interpretation of the. Maybe he doesn't mean to say that if you have techeiles, you don't put it on. Chas v'shulim. Maybe he means to say that we just won't have techeiles because of this, because of the reason he says. So there will not be techeiles shaloi b'zman habayis. Again, he can't say that because obviously there was techeiles shaloi b'zman habayis. So he obviously doesn't mean to say there cannot be techeiles. Also, I mean, what do you think is going to happen when the Beis Mikdash gets built? So the same day that they're going to build the Beis Mikdash, that same day they're going to discover the techeiles and they're going to start dyeing wool, and everyone's going to be mechir. What? I mean, wouldn't it come about like a little bit before the binyan Beis Mikdash, as actually the Seifer, one of the Chivas Vurim, the Yeshiyas Malkoi, actually says that, it could be that before the Ge'ila, techeiles will reemerge. It's obviously something we're going to need after the Beis Mikdash is built, after Mashiach comes. So maybe, we're hoping the Mashiach is going to come any day. So now's the time. The techeiles obviously at some point is going to be rediscovered. So who's to say it's not rediscovered now? But what the Riyah Kudish is saying, without putting words into his mouth, which those interpretations are clearly doing, he doesn't say there cannot be techeiles shaloi b'zman habayis. He doesn't say that if there's techeiles, you don't wear it. What he does say is that, why the Rabbi Bentzion needs all of these kavunas. He needs it because you need it in the world. It's the tiknu oilam, all these kavunas for the kavuna, al pi kabula, what's needed to correct whatever is needed, whatever the mitzvahs accomplish in the oilam u'al yoinim. So how could it be that we're living in the world without it? If it's something that we need. So the Riyah Kudish says that it gets this kavuna, it gets accomplished, not through us. We're not capable of doing it anyway. So that's why the Rabbi Bentzion didn't give us techeiles for this time, because we anyway are not able to have this kavuna. Kind of explains how it could be that the Rabbi Bentzion would allow this to happen, that we shouldn't have the mitzvah. That's what he says. He says, therefore, we don't have techeiles b'zman hazeh because we're not able to be mekayim this kavuna. But he doesn't say we will not have techeiles b'zman hazeh. That's putting words into his mouth. He doesn't say that if you have techeiles, you put it. That's putting words into his mouth. Chas v'shulim. And the fact of the matter is, we've proven beyond the doubt that we have techeiles b'zman hazeh. And the Riyah Kudish does not say different. Then there's another kasha which people ask, and that is the issue of mesorah. The issue of mesorah, where people say you cannot do a mitzvah that we do not have a direct tradition to be Mekayim. In other words, this is a mitzvah that hasn't been given over from generation to generation. We didn't receive it from our fathers, from our Rebbes. It's something that it's been lost and it's re-emerging now. We're not Mekayim a mitzvah that we don't have a tradition how to be Mekayim. I mean, besides the fact that all those poskim that I mentioned that say that there's a chash that the Techeiles will come back, it could come back. Obviously, that's not the halucha. The halucha is that you are Mekayim a mitzvah if it reemerges, even though it has been lost for numerous generations. So this whole premise is obviously not correct. I don't know on what basis one would make such a premise. Like, what kind of rule is that? I mean, we have rules in the Torah, and the Torah says all the mitzvahs that you have to do, and we have to do them. So somebody would say, well, even if we know how to be Mekayim this mitzvah, we know what the mitzvah is, but, it depends how we know. If the way we know how to do the mitzvah is because we heard it from our fathers, our Rebbes, then we should listen to the Torah and do what the Torah says. But if the way we know is through other ways, even though we know, we're sure, and there's no question about it, but I don't like the way you know. I don't like the way you found out what the Rabbi Shalom is telling you to do. Don't listen to him. You found out in the wrong way. And that's absurd. How could there be such a thing? There cannot be such a thing. There is no such thing. And that's why there were a lot of Gedolim that even when the Radzin discovered his Techeiles, and he said for sure that his Techeiles is Techeiles, and there were a lot of Gedolim who didn't know, but they just said, something, if the Radzin says so, let's put it on, let's wear the Techeiles just in case. They didn't have this idea that you need something has to be given over traditionally from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation. There is no such idea in Haluch. When we find sometimes an Iyun of mesorah, we find in the Halucha of Oifis that the Mechaber talks about how there are simunim to know which Oifis, which types of poultry, which fowl are kusha. So there are 3 simunim to be able to tell what's kusha. And then you also have to know that it's not a doiris, that it's not a predator. So then there are another 2 simunim. And the Mechaber says if you have these simunim, you're allowed to eat it. And the Marshal is Michael even more. And he says that you don't even need all the 5 simunim. The original 3 simunim are enough. You could eat it. The Prichudish Paskins like the Mechaber. There are poskim who say you can go and eat it. The Ramu says, no, we do not eat birds without a mesorah. Unless we have a tradition where somebody knows its identity because they've been shown this bird from somebody of previous who knew the identity, you have to have a mesorah. So what do we have here? Why? Because it says, why is the Ramu say you have to be mach? We have 5 simunim. It says because it might be that you might make a mistake. Even after the simunim, maybe it's a predator. We found that there are certain birds which have these simunim, and they're not completely conclusive. They could still be a predator. So then it's not kusha. So it's obviously not it's not a species which is kusha. So this doesn't prove it enough. So we have here that simunim, a lot of poskim hold, you're allowed to rely on it even to be Michael and to eat something, which we don't have to eat it. Doesn't say anywhere in the Torah that you have to eat this bird. It's not a mitzvah, it's not a chid, but it's you're allowed to. Comes the Ramu and says, no, we should not eat it because, first of all, why should we be Michael? There's no chiyuv to eat it. And if we would eat it, we would turn out to be wrong. Then it would turn out that we're being oiva on an issa. We're eating something which is not kosher. So you want to take that idea and flip it and say that we should be Michael and not do a mitzvah out of a lack of mesorah. Here we have poskim that say that we could be Michael and eat something which is a rishis and not be concerned of a issa, even though we don't have a mesorah. The Ramu says we should be machem and we should be concerned of a issa. So you're going to take that to say that therefore we need a mesorah and we should be Michael and not be mekayim a mitzvah when it has been clearly identified with proofs? So, in fact, this would be similar. Let's say somebody finds a bird which is kusha according to all of the simunim, but we don't eat it because we don't have a mesorah. So the Ramu says we don't eat it. So we have a mitzvah of shaliach haken. If you want to take the eggs or the young birds, you have to send away the mother. Would we be allowed to take the eggs of this bird that we have simunim that it's kusha, but we don't have a mesorah? Of course not, because it's probably kusha. We're just machma not to eat it, but we can't be Michael and say that you don't have to be mekayim shalach shalach. there is actually a chief in Minchas Eluzah who goes through this shal. The reason he asks the question to begin with, it's totally not a question. Of course, we won't be Michael. But it says, Ve'es habunim tikach loch. So he says, maybe it has to be the kind of bird that you'll actually end up being able to eat. And since for whatever reason it is, we won't eat it, so maybe the halucha doesn't apply. But he says, no, if it's kusha, it applies. So here we are, we have Techeiles, we've proven Techeiles. Someone says, don't be mekayem the mitzvah. We're going to be Michael and we're going to not do a mitzvah. Even if it would be wrong, there would be no is. It's not like eating taif and a bird. I mean, the Yeshiyas Malkai, who doesn't agree with the Techeiles of the Radzin, says there's no harm in wearing it. You don't have to fight with somebody who put it on his tzitzis already because it lo yahayel lovin. So it's no worse than tzitzis that are not dyed at all. It's still kusha as tzitzis as luva. So there's no downside. So on such a thing, you're going to say that you need a mesorah. This idea of a mesorah is brought in the name of the Beis Halevi. And the Beis Halevi is quoted in a letter that the Radzin had received. I don't know who wrote the letter, whether it was the Beis Halevi himself or a shliach. It says this. It says something totally different. It says that you're identifying the chillazon as being the cuttlefish. That is a type of a creature that we've had all the time and has never been lost. So if you can explain to me why, over all of the generations, they did not have Techeiles, what did you discover that wasn't known all along? Either you discovered the actual species, the actual chillazon, or you discovered the way of dyeing it. Tell me, what is it that you know how to do that we didn't know all along? If you can tell me that, then we will in fact be obligated. The Beis Halevi, he agrees he'll be obligated, but you have to explain, because if there is no answer to that question, then the fact that they didn't wear it all along means that they understood that the cuttlefish is not the chillazon, because otherwise they would have worn it. So by that version of the words of the Beis Halevi, the way it's quoted in the letter that the Beis Halevi sent to the Radzin, obviously that doesn't apply to the murex trunkless. We know very well what happened, that there was a decree by the Roman emperors that nobody's allowed to wear Techeiles. And then over the generations, the entire art of dyeing with chillazon got lost, as the Radva says, because they discovered cheaper ways of producing blue. Because obviously the color, I know there was the discussion earlier in this event about whether the Techeiles that the Iyun used for tzitzis is the same as the Techeiles that the Goyim used. Obviously, the Radvaz holds it was. He says that the fact that in the industry they no longer made Techeiles, so therefore Iyun also don't have Techeiles, because it's the same Techeiles, and it became a totally lost art, because now we have cheaper and easier ways of producing the blue dye. So therefore it's gotten lost. We know exactly why it has gotten lost. First, there was a decree from the emperors, and we weren't allowed to wear it. And that's what we actually brought also in the Ben Yehuda. On the Gemara, he says that there was a decree that the Yidden were not allowed to wear Techeiles. He learns it from the Gemara. I'm not going to get into that. And we know historically there was a decree on all kinds of Techeiles, all kinds of purpura dye. And that's why it got lost. It's very simple. So Beis Halevi would ask his question, what exactly happened and why did you reemerge now? What did you find out that we didn't know all along? We have a very clear answer to that question. There is another version of the words of the Beis Halevi, and that's something which is known in the family of the descendants of the Beis Halevi. In one of the Sfurim, which brings this idea from one of the descendants of the Beis Halevi, he writes this, and I'll quote it. She'ain rayis v'svuras yecholos lohichiach shim dova. Proofs and the svuras logic cannot prove anything. B'mile the shayche lemesorahs shel sha'alavichu yagaitu. And something which applies to a tradition which comes under the category of sha'alavichu yagaitu. Ask your father, he'll tell you. Which means a mesorah from generation to generation. Sham, in those types of things. In other words, not every mitzvah is like that, but there are types of haluchas that are shaykh to the union of mesorah. There, ein hasvura machriya. A svura cannot be the deciding factor. Ki im, only ha-mesorah atzma. Only an actual tradition to say, kach ru yovas, that's what the father saw, v'kach in hagid, and that's what we have to do. Now, this is brought in connection to the family of the descendants of the Beis Halevi, bring this in connection to Techeiles. Let me say this. If there would be a cipher that would say, a cipher from the earlier Rishon that would say, and we have such svura. The cipher says that it is the murex trunculus, it is the pilpira, that's the chillazon of the Techeiles. Got lost, and if anyone can find it and figure out how to die with it and everything, then that's what was used with Techeiles. That would certainly be a mesorah. That's somebody identifying it. I mean, we have to speak to him directly. What about on Zoom? I mean, is that good? And if we find it in the cipher, it's not good? What he says is, what this statement is, what do you mean things that are shayich to sha'alu vichu yagait? What does that mean? That means that when something needs a definition, we have a word, chilazon. The word chilazon has to be defined. So how am I going to know the definition of a word? The only way to know such a thing is by tradition. So someone's going to try to figure it out. This must be what the word chilazon means. Because it says that the chilazon is like the sea, it's like a fish, it's like this, it grows, the skin grows with it. Then, something, that must be the definition of the word chilazon. The word chilazon is a word that needs a definition. When you need a definition, it's not something that you can prove by proofs. It's something that you either know the definition or you don't know the definition. So how do you know a definition? Because it's been given over traditionally. It's a language, it's been used, it's a word. So that is the mesorah of it. But if you don't have that, then it's just trying to figure out and guess what could possibly be the definition of the word chilazon. So he says things that are shaykh to sha'alu vichu yagaitu. There are certain things that need to be identified, and without a tradition, you can't identify them. So that was relevant to the chilazon of the Radzin, because on the basis of certain simunim, he decided that a cuttlefish is the definition of the word chilazon. We do not prove what the definition of the word chilazon is from proofs and from simunim, because that would be, some sort of a svura. We have the definition of the word chilazon, as I have discussed earlier. We know what the word chilazon means. It's written in Sfurim, it's written in Rishonim, it's written in Achronim. We have Achronim who say that the pilpir is the Techeiles. That's a mesorah. That is Gedolei Yisrael clearly identifying and pinpointing and saying this is what it is. The Beis HaLevi would certainly agree to that by all versions of the statement of the Beis HaLevi. So with this, I want to conclude that, again, it's important. I think the most important thing in this discussion, the actual proofs that the chilazon and the actual discussion, it speaks for itself. I think anyone who looks into it objectively and hasn't made up his mind before he began will certainly and does certainly come to the conclusion that this is the chilazon, this is the Techeiles. So what we really need to do is we need to let down our guard and allow ourselves to have an open mind and an open heart. It's a beautiful thing that Yidden don't want to do things different than their fathers and that their Rebbes did. That's beautiful, and it's the way it should be. But there are certain things that if the Rebbes would have had, they would have done it too. The fact is they didn't have it. There were times, and there were Gedolei Yisrael who lamented the fact that they can't be Mekayim this mitzvah. And if they would have been able to be Mekayim it, they would have, as we knew, a lot of Gedolei Yisrael, we know, tried to be Mekayim it with the Radzin's Techeiles, even though they weren't convinced, but the Radzin said so. Certainly, the Gedolei Yisrael, our forefathers, our Rebbes, would have been Mekayim. We're not deviating from our tradition by being Mekayim a mitzvah which we have available to us, which is something which is it's a kaile, is it Yushan, Chudash Mule Yushan. It looks like it's a new vessel, but it's carrying old material from the Torah, from the times of the previous generations when they were Mekayim the mitzvah. So therefore, we should be Mekayim the mitzvah, and through that we'll be Zoiche to all the sigillis of the mitzvah. We'll be Duvik Bashem. It says that Isam Oisa, if you look at the tzitzis, and a lot of the Rishonim, the Ramban, and other Mefoshim say it refers specifically to the Techeiles, because the Techeiles reminds us of the Kisar Kuved. Is a Charatem is Kol Mitzvah Hashem. It's a reminder if a person has a problem. What should I do? I have the Eitz HaHara is giving me such a hard time. So the Torah gives an Eitz. Just look at your Techeiles. You'll remember all the mitzvahs. You'll do them. The Techeiles is such a mitzvah which enriches us to be Mekayim the whole Torah. The Eibishter should help us that we should be able to be Mekayim the mitzvahs.
Shkoyach Rabbi Halberstam, thank you. Wow. Amazing. I know that we've gone a little bit over. There are still a few questions if the Rav would be available for a few questions after?
Yes.
Okay, great.
I don't promise that I will know the answers to them.
Okay, listen, I'm not expecting you to know the answers. I mean, sometimes saying I don't know is also a good answer.
Right.
So, okay, one question by Abe Lederer. He asked this in the beginning. The Pnei Yoshua in Bav Metzia, page 61, writes, Midiraisa, it is mutter lechatchila to wear a talis that doesn't have techeles. Tosfos Menachos, page 41, writes that a talis that has only one min would be ksher. Wouldn't this imply that it is legitimate to claim that techeles is merely a mitzvah min mufchar?
Okay, I will say that he had asked me this question before. It's not this time. And I answered it. It's hard to get into it right now because it's a little bit technical in terms of understanding the Pnai Yeshia. The Pnai Yeshia cannot mean that it's not a chiyuv because it's all the sources of the Gemura and the Rishonim say that it's a chiyuv. But just in a nutshell, the Pnai Yeshia, to the best of my recollection, if a person owns a beged that does not have Techeiles, is it necessarily a violation of the mitzvah of Techeiles? Because then he will wear that beged one day that doesn't have Techeiles. The answer is no, because not always is it an issa to put on a beged that doesn't have Techeiles. For instance, at a time that Techeiles is not available, or if a person would find himself in a place where he doesn't have Techeiles, it's impossible to get Techeiles. So as we mentioned from the Shagis Aryeh, you put on a talis and you wear luva and you're mekayim at least that mitzvah that we could be mekayim. So the actual putting Techeiles onto a beged, putting luva onto a beged and not putting on Techeiles is not yet a violation necessarily of the mitzvah of Techeiles, because there could be a circumstance where he would be allowed to wear that beged, except that if you put on kala ilon, that's deception. That's going to cause somebody to wear such a beged even in a time where Techeiles is available, because he's going to think he has Techeiles. Then he will be mevatel the mitzvah of Techeiles. In light of this hakdumah, if you read the Pnai Yeshia, you will see that what he means to say is that it is not necessarily a violation. It is not always a violation to wear a talis without Techeiles. Therefore, just merely preparing such a beged is not a issa. In terms of the Tosfos and Menuchos, it's too lengthy and too complicated, but it is a misrepresentation of the Tosfos and Menuchos. And additionally, it cannot be. I've already shown that all of the Rishonim say it's a chiyuv goma.
Okay, very good. So that's one question. Another question comes from Reb Shmuel Yitzchak Eisenberg. He asks, and by the way, there's another person who actually touched on the top on this, that no speaker spoke about Safek Midirais L'Chimra, so maybe this could be part of a much larger topic. So Shmuel Yitzchak Eisenberg asks, does Safek Midirais L'Chimra, does that apply to Techeiles? My understanding has always been that we only say L'Chimra when we know after the fact that we fulfill the mitzvah with 100% certainty, such as if we don't remember we said benching, we bench again because now we know we fulfilled the mitzvah. By Techeiles, are we at 100% certainty, or are we only at 99.9%?
Okay, so let me answer that on several levels. First of all, we are at 100% certainty because 99.9% is 100% certainty. There is a hakdumah of the Milchamis, the Ramban in his hakdumah to the Sefer Milchamis Hashem. He writes that the Torah is not mathematics, where things get proven like mathematically, where something is clearly, it's black and white. The way we build a halucha is when something seems to be the halucha, then that is certainly the halucha. We have acheram lahatos in the Torah. We have all kinds of means. It's not that way. It's not like a mathematical equation. So he says that's something we apply bain lechimre, bain lekille, even to administer dina nefushis. We go with such a thing as certainty. So when we have these rayas are mechayiv. That's one. Additionally, the Chazon Ish in the Sefer Masa Ish is quoted to have said in connection to the Chilazon of the Radzin that even if there would only have been a tzel tziloi shel sufik, which in our language means a shadow of a doubt, that the Chilazon of the Radzin is correct, all of the Gedolim of his time would have been mechiv to wear it. Only because of its tzel tziloi shel sufik, that would have been enough to be mechayev all the Gedolim of the times of the Radzin to wear the Techeiles. And the fact that they didn't is because they knew that there isn't even a shadow of a doubt. It totally is wrong. There's no chance that this is the Chilazon. As I mentioned from the Yeshivas Malkoi, he says it's only a hashur. It's nothing more than a guess. You can just as easily point to any organism in the sea and say that's what it is. It's a blindfolded guess. Then let's get to the question of Sufik Derais Lechem. Yes, there is such a shitta. It is not the ikeshite lahalucha that we were only mekayim sufik derais lechimre if after the kiyum we know for sure we were mekayim it. We find that if we have an esrig, which is a sufik, if it's mirkiv or not, we have all times that we have a mitzvah that it's a sufik. The poskim say you should do the mitzvah misufik, even though at the end of it maybe you weren't mekayim the mitzvah, but we still do the mitzvah. We find this many times in halucha. So it is not the normative halucha. There is such a shitta, but it isn't the normative halucha. The ikke shitta is that sufik derais lechimre applies even when we remain with the suffix afterwards. But again, that's all not relevant because we don't have a suffix, we have a vadai. As Rabbi Bentzion said once when he was asked, someone asked him, somebody was trying to say that it's not chayes, said, do you think after all that I said, somebody tried to build an argument that it's not correct, do you think after all that I said there's still a chance that the murex trunculus is the Chilazon of the Techeiles? And his answer was, it's a vadai. In other words, I don't think it's a chance. I think it's a vadai. It is certainly the Techeiles. And as such, the whole discussion of Sufik Derais Lechimre is not relevant.
Shkoyach. Next question is from Josh Fogel. He asks, mesorah is used in other places for halacha. For example, outside of Eretz Yisrael, most poskim write that chadash is asur min Torah, which is we know the Chassam Sofer basically hijacked for his own attack on the
Melitza.
Huh?
He used it as a melitza, as Gedolim sometimes did.
Exactly, but in this case, Chadash refers to the grains, right? So Chadash asur min Torah. However, one opinion writes that it is allowed. The mesorah has been to eat Chadash outside of Eretz Yisrael. Also, this Techeiles is very expensive, and how can you say that people should purchase it? Isn't this bal tashchus of people's money?
Well, then it's bal tashchus to buy a lulav and esrig, and it's bal tashchus to build a sikkah. Every mitzvah is bal tashchus because it costs money. I mean, what is bal tashchus? It's bal tashchus to eat, actually, because when you eat, you're taking perfectly good food and ruining it. It goes into your stomach and it gets all ruined. And that's I knew somebody actually who used to say, you asked him, "Was machst du?" So he said, "Ich mach kal ya essen." What are you doing? How are you doing? He said, "Oh, what I'm doing is I'm destroying food." It was a kind of a humble way of describing his existence. So you say that doing a mitzvah is bal tashchus. I don't like saying that. It's not nice to say that. It's a mitzvah. It's not bal tashchus. I guess the reason you're saying that, to be done l'kavschis, and in all fairness, which is certainly what you mean, is that you don't believe that it is really the Techeiles. So therefore, if it's only just a possibility, a little suffix, so then maybe we shouldn't spend the money on that. I mean, that's probably what you mean, but it's not so. This is the Techeiles, and it's a chiyuv, and therefore you have to put it on. In terms of what was the first thing he mentioned, just to get back to that.
I'm just going to repeat the question. So he said that mesorah is used in other places for halacha, for example.
Yes, he talked about chudash, right? So he talked about chudash. So in connection, chudash is a big discussion, and it's famous. The Bach was mata chudash because of his feike, which is there's no way that we can. That's ridiculous. You're telling me that we were mevat, that we eat chudash, which is usa, because of a tradition which goes against halucha. Chas v'shulam. The Bach said that chudash ben chitzlu it's his mitzvah because it's his feike, and halucha on his feike is that it's mitzvah. Today, many poskim say that Sfek Sfaika is no longer there because one of the Sfaikis of the Sfek Sfaika is that we don't know when these grains are from. Maybe they're old, maybe they're not chudash. So that's part of it. That's part of what goes into the equation. And since today we do know and we're able to know and every batch is identified, the heter of the bach is no longer relevant. And many and most poskim today know that and aser chudash.
Very good. Very good. I'm sorry that we've already gone a little bit over, or more than a little bit over. I have a couple of questions, a couple of personal questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
So you mentioned you were talking about the linguistics, about how we know that chillazon means snail. First of all, I found out, interestingly enough, a little while back, that just like limtza, right? Limtza means snail in Old French. In Italian, even today, the word lumaca also means snail. So lumaca and limtza sounds very, very, very similar. And all European languages are connected. But with modern French, right? Limetz, more accurately, does not mean a snail, but it means a slug. And escargot, as we know, is a snail. That's considered to be a delicacy in France. I'm curious to know, because you mentioned you saw this in an Old French dictionary. I'm curious to know if you have the Old French dictionary on hand, so that we can see where the word limtza translates as a snail. Also another thing, shablul, more accurately means a land snail as opposed to a sea snail. So should we be concerned about this diuk?
Okay, so I don't know what you're saying about shablil, that it means a land snail and not a sea snail. I will say I don't know.
Okay.
In terms of the difference between a snail that has a shell, a slug with a shell, and a slug without a shell, I am aware of that. And it seems that over time, the differentiation became more defined. It used to be that these two words were used interchangeably. And that's, it seems to be indicated that way in my old dictionary. It'll take me a couple of minutes to find it. If there would be another speaker after me, I would be able to look for it while that's going on. But it seems that I don't know if there is. But yeah, in the old French dictionary, it does say that generally, there's a difference between limtze and limtzon. And generally, one of them, I don't remember which is the one and which is the other, but one of them usually refers to one with a shell and one not, and it's not always used that way. And that's something that has developed later, and originally it was more freely used interchangeably.
Okay, very good. Next, sorry, so one or two more questions, if that's okay. You mentioned about prepira being referred to as the actual type of shnek. Is there? Do you see if there's a difference between the Greek word purpura and the other Greek word porphyros? Because according to the Woodhouse English Greek dictionary, porphyros literally means the color purple as opposed to the actual creature.
Okay, so I don't really know Greek. And I guess maybe perfuros could be that which is derived from purpira. And we know that just like purpirin and persinen, right? So purpirin means Techeiles, as we heard about the ravye. It means something that is derived from the purpira. And the same way, maybe purpiros also is that way. I'm not that much of a linguist to be able to tell you. But certainly the word purpira means the snail.
Okay, and last but certainly not least, you were talking about how when the Radziners came up with their cuttlefish theory, that Rav Poskim, Rav Gedolei Yisrael, did not accept that as the Chilazon. I know that with Lubavitch in particular, with the new Techeiles, you have a handful that actually are wearing, but the vast majority don't because they feel very strongly on the Rebbe Rashab, rejecting the first one. But supposedly with the Rebbe Rashab, his issue was more so that he simply could not believe, or he could not understand how this chilazon that the Radzin Rebbe found, how that was it, because it looked completely different from what he understood. Is the Rebbe able to elaborate on that?
I don't really know much about that. I did once read somebody who wrote someone who's a proponent of the Techeiles that we have, and he wrote about what the words of the Rishab, and he explained that the Rishab would not be against this Techeiles, but I can't get into any specifics because I don't know.
Okay, very good. Thank you very, very much, Rabbi Halberstam, for giving your time and answering these very relevant questions. So thank you.
Thank you.